This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. I'm no landscape photographer, but it seems to me that there's a challenge that presents itself pretty early on in landscape photography. And that is, how do I make sure that I'm making images that are truly mine and not just going out there and taking the same sorts of images of the same famous vistas as everybody else? I've just returned from a trip to New Zealand, and the first few days I was teaching and speaking at the PSNZ conference in Nelson, which was great fun, but then I got to hop on a plane and travel further south to go spend some time with my friend Richard, who lives on Lake Wanaka. When I first arrived, he took me on a bike ride around the lake, and as we were circumnavigating the shoreline, we passed by the famous Wanaka tree. Now, you will have seen loads of pictures of this particular tree by this particular lake. But even if you weren't familiar with that tree, you couldn't miss it when you were passing by, just because of the huge number of people who were surrounding that little tree. There were so many photographers standing around trying to get that same shot. And there was even an orderly queue forming of people who wanted to go stand in front and take a selfie of themselves in front of the tree. It's a proper attraction now. And Richard even told me that he'd been past on some early mornings when the light was good to find 80 to 100 photographers all set up with their forest of tripods, all to capture the same shot of the same little tree. Now, Richard is himself an acclaimed landscape photographer, and he also takes tours around that beautiful region of New Zealand where he takes other photographers around to some of the most beautiful locations, not the Wanaka tree, and he helps them to get better and improve their own landscape photography. In fact, I met Richard because he came on my Italy retreat last year, and he presented some of his images to the group. His work made a big impression on all of us, and not just because he's obviously a talented landscape photographer, but because the quiet intimacy and intricate complexity of the shots he was showing us was so impressive. He shoots the big, attention-grabbing vistas that New Zealand is so well known for, but those weren't the images he showed us. He showed us the work that he really loves, which are quieter images made in smaller scenes. I'd already heard the term intimate landscape photography before I met Richard, but it was seeing his images, I think, for the first time that I really saw what was possible in that space. But to make those sorts of images, you really need to develop that keener eye that can see the finer details and those more artistic compositions in the small things in our landscape, rather than just going out to do the trophy hunting of the big vistas that everybody else is getting images of too. And for me, Richard really has that vision. So on this trip, I sat down with Richard and interviewed him, asking him about intimate landscape photography, about the importance of printing, and why he quit social media. And I can't wait for you to watch this film. So I'm going to shut up now and let you hear from my friend, Richard Young.
So my photography started with a connection with nature. I was lucky to grow up in the South Downs National Park in England, and spent a lot of time in the forests when I was young. So I had that early connection with forests and trees. There was lots of deer where I lived, and I used to love going out and trying to photograph these deer, which was quite a challenge really. Early on in my photography, I did do a fair amount of wildlife photography, but then later on I found that it was really the landscape I had the connection with, not the wildlife. So some of my connection with landscape photography really happened when I came here to New Zealand in 2004, and I decided to do a black and white photography course. And then I focused a lot more on the landscape, but to start with, it was actually some urban landscapes near where I was living. And then I started to spend some time exploring some of the national parks and the wilderness areas and carrying the camera with me and wanting to photograph that nature that I found out there and kind of share some of those views and those vistas that I was seeing out in these amazing wild places with other people. After that, I actually did go back to the UK for a couple of years, and I set up a darkroom there for a few years, and I was shooting mainly on black and white film, but I started shooting on a lot medium format and colour transparency film, and spent some time travelling across Africa and photographing the big desert landscapes there, big dunes in Namibia, and that's when I kind of knew that I wanted my focus to be landscape photography, and that was something that I wanted to develop further. So my first series of work that I actually exhibited was a series called Alpine Light, which I took when I started doing some mountaineering here in New Zealand, and I started carrying the camera out into the mountains with me. The idea of the series was to focus on the changing light in the mountains and the way it played across these snowscapes. And I suppose that first exhibition, that Alpine Light exhibition, was a turning point in my photography because I got really good feedback from the work that I made. And one of the images from the series actually won Best Landscape at the Banff Mountain Photography Competition, which led it to be displayed over in Canada at the Banff Mountain Film Festival. After that, I spent some time overseas, and when I came back to New Zealand, I actually had the opportunity of running this little local art gallery, and I made one room of the gallery all my work and another room was 5 local artists. So at that point, my real focus with my landscape work was focusing on a lot of the grand New Zealand vistas and these sort of iconic landscapes here in New Zealand. And to be quite honest, that's what sold well in my gallery. And most of the people that came in and brought those prints, they brought them because they had a connection with that place. They'd been to those landscapes and they had a fond memory there, and they wanted that in their house, and that's why they were selecting those images. So then I started running photography tours and workshops, and I was spending a lot of time on the road, and I just didn't have the time to look after the gallery and be away at the same time. So I had to give up on the idea of having my own gallery, and largely at that point of focusing on my own photography, and my sole sort of work within my photography at that point became mainly teaching and guiding other photographers. And a lot of the time I was taking them to these same classic iconic landscapes, and everybody wanted to go and photograph these big grand vistas like Tasman Lake at Mount Cook and Lake Madison and that classic Wanaka tree. And I almost lost a little bit my love and my passion for photography because I started thinking, well, I don't want to take a photograph here today. And even if I do take a really good photograph, any accomplished landscape photographer could come back to that landscape the next day and take something similar and maybe even better than what I just took. And it almost became that photography became this great game of trying to capture the next best version of this same landscape. For a couple of years, I almost stopped shooting, and I was spending a lot of time guiding and teaching. And then I realized I had to start seeing the landscape in a bit of a different way and see beyond these grand vistas. And there was actually more to the landscape than just these big grand vistas. So around the same time, I was actually spending so much time traveling, I decided to give up the rent on the flat I had, and I moved into a VW camper, and I was living in this VW camper between all the workshops and tours that I was running. But one thing that enabled me was to travel even a bit more in my own time and spend some more time in landscapes, immersed in these landscapes. And during that sort of process of spending more time in one landscape, I started to see things a little bit differently, and I started to see beyond the obvious vistas and actually these smaller, more intimate landscapes within the grander landscape. And I think that came from building a connection to these places by spending more time in them. And I think as photographers, it's always so attractive to go and shoot new places all the time, but I kind of find at the moment my best work comes from some of the landscapes I've got to know really, really well. I find myself keep returning to these same places, and sometimes I think, surely I'm done here. Surely there's not a fresh way that I can approach this landscape, or there's not any better work that I can produce here. But each time I think that, I kind of see the landscape in a bit of a different way. And I think part of it is like an evolution of my vision as an artist and what I see within the landscape. But part of it's just getting to know that landscape as well. So I photographed the shot that won the landscape category of the New Zealand Geographic Photographer of the Year competition here 2 years ago. So I had this sort of idea that I'd tried out the year before of these leaves out of focus in the foreground shooting through the leaves. And I hadn't quite got the shot I wanted the year before, so I kind of returned with a little bit of an idea, but it was actually completely different from what I'd even tried the year before. It worked really nicely. I had some gorgeous mist there in the forest that morning, which really helped with that separation. But I felt it did express sort of the feeling of being here in autumn in this forest, and it is a magical place, and trying to capture that in a photograph is difficult, and a photograph that sort of expresses that feeling. My approach to photography has really changed over that time, and I was photographing the really big grand vistas to start with, and I probably would have walked past something like this and probably not have spent the time there to photograph it. But also I think getting to know this tree and coming back here every year has helped me see past some of those obvious shots. There's so many different ways to approach the landscape, and sometimes getting tighter to those more intimate and abstract views of the landscape is really, really rewarding, and it enables you to capture photographs that people haven't before. And it is a bit more of an abstract and artistic representation of the landscape rather than as straight one sort of capturing what's in front of you. And I think that's what I try to do with my photography these days. It's trying to produce something you couldn't have seen with your own eyes. If you were standing there at that moment, you wouldn't have seen that. And I think that's really rewarding when you can create photographs that you kind of actually make your own in some ways. The first shots I made of this tree were sort of light shafting through the mist, and they were a lot more sort of in-your-face shots, full of colour, but now I've just tried to really simplify my approach. So returning to this one tree every year, it's almost become like an old friend, and I've got to know it, and that's enabled me to see beyond the obvious shots, beyond the shots that you would just photograph that sort of straight portrait of the tree. There's lots of times I go out into the landscape and I just don't see anything I want to shoot, and some mornings I'll just wander about and I'll come back with no images at all, but I feel fine about that. I don't see that as a wasted morning. Going out to the landscape and spending a morning engaged in it, enjoying it. I'll even sit there and I can't find anything that I want to photograph, or the conditions aren't quite what I want. So I quite often carry a journal with me, and I'll get my journal out, and sometimes I'll make some notes of the landscape about what I feel about the landscape, or even sometimes I'll make some sketches of it. And I'm definitely not good at sketching, but I'll make these little rough sketches, and sometimes through that process I'll even see different things within the landscape. And there's times that I've sort of sat down, I thought, oh, there's nothing to photograph today, and I've started making some notes, or I've done a little sketch, and then I've seen something different in the landscape. And I think that's one thing that's important for me, is to slow down within the landscape and just take it at a more relaxed pace. And if I go out there and I'm trying to rush about taking pictures of everything, and pictures of stuff that I don't feel that I need to make a photograph of, that uses a lot of my creative energy, which I need to sort of keep there for when I've got a subject that I'm really engaged with. So the other morning we went out to those ponds for sunrise, and we had some amazing light that morning, and it was the sort of light that years ago that I would chase as a landscape photographer. It was that big epic sunrise, and it was like 360 degrees of colour. It was almost too much. And you sort of didn't know which way to point your camera, and the mountains were lighting up to the side, and there was gorgeous reflections of all the trees across the lake with this big fiery sky above. And I took one quick image of some of the trees reflecting in the lake, just for the sake of it to start with. But then I sort of changed my focus, and I started shooting these birch trees that were off to the side, and they were just positioned against some other birch trees. They didn't have the lake in them at all, but what I had was this amazing warm light that was actually lighting up the sky, and they were casting this gorgeous hue onto the birch trees. And it was a really beautiful light to work in. But behind me, there was these big mountains and all these clouds, and everything was basically on fire. And sometimes it's so hard not to photograph that, not to see that thing that shouts so loudly at you. And actually, like, it was some of the best light to photograph that, but it was also the best light to photograph these trees, and photographing them in that low, soft light with that gorgeous hue casting on them. I can spend easily half an hour or more just on that one frame, making really small movements, looking at how different branches sit with each other within the frame. And I get a lot of enjoyment out of that, and I feel that I'm really engaged in the landscape at that moment, and really engaged in wanting to make this perfect expression within that one frame. So the first thing I always do when I come back from any shoot like we were on yesterday is I pick my favourite 4 images and I just quickly process them, just 2 minutes each, and I lay them up on one sheet of paper and I print them up as small prints like this. I then put these on the wall in the office just so I can live with them and decide if I'm happy with the images or if I'm happy with where I've taken the quick edits, and where I then want to take further edits with the work to make the print sort of match as a rendition of what I was trying to express. When I printed this photo off, first off on the little test strip, I knew straight away when it came out the printer I wasn't quite happy with it, and it looked okay on the computer screen, and even if you soft proof something on a screen, there's nothing like having a hard proof of a print. And I looked at it and straight away I felt it was a little bit too dark, and I really wanted this light, airy feeling of being there in that forest the other morning, and the print didn't express that. So having that initial proof of the print enabled me to go and make those further edits. Even with a good computer screen, they're still always backlit, and you've got light shining through the back of an image, but with a print it's a reflected surface, and we're using that reflected light off of the print. So it is a different medium, and it always does look slightly different to a screen, even if your screen is well calibrated. Yeah, like I think sometimes with more subtle images, you do have to live with them for a while, and they do need to grow on you because they don't have that initial impact. But if you've got a big grand landscape, it's got that impact straight away, and it might look great to start with, but then you live with it for a while and it sort of wears off. But sort of a more nuanced image like these forest shots, it's something you can keep going back to, and there's so many details in there that you just keep looking at that photograph and it sort of draws you in each time. So I think printing is just such an important part of the way I work as a photographer, and it's not a final photograph until it is a print, and it's that print that's that end rendition, that end expression of the photograph, and it's never going to change. Like it's set there in stone, and when I sign a print, I'm sort of signing it to say that's the completed print that I'm happy with, and to represent me as a photographer. Even the paper you choose as a photographer, it's part of your style, it's part of what that end print's going to look like. And printing on these lovely, beautiful cotton rag textured papers for my work really works, and it adds to that sort of subtle expression of the images. These images would not look the same on with deep blacks on a photographic glossy paper. It just wouldn't suit this work. So it's printing. That end paper choice is part of the end expression of your work as well. Prints are also tactile. They're something that's real, something we can hold in our hands, and we go to all this effort as photographers to make this beautiful work, and we don't want to just hide that away on a computer. Like, we want to enjoy it ourselves and share it with others, and I think prints really are the perfect medium for that. I think also we engage with prints in a much different way than we do with an image on a screen. If you give someone an iPad, they'll just flick through the images. But as photographers, we want people to engage with our work. That's what we want to achieve as a photographer. And I think print is the way to do that. Like, someone will study a print and look at all those details, especially with more subtle or nuanced work, and that doesn't have that initial impact, sort of like the impact that would grab you on, say, Instagram or something like that. And they are images that you do need to study more and spend more time with. So one thing I love about this style of photography, photographing these sort of more intimate landscapes, is I feel that I can make work that's my own, that no other photographer could go out and capture that same photograph. The tree will change, the angles will change, the light will change. There's just so many elements that you're bringing together to make that one image that it could never be replicated, which is really rewarding because you know you're actually making something that nobody else is going to go and essentially make something very similar, let alone the same. And there's really nothing wrong with shooting the big grand vistas, and I still do it myself. I still shoot those big vistas. We were at Mount Cook the other evening and we had this amazing light, this huge lenticular cloud out over the mountains, and that evening the shot was the grand vista and you could capture a beautiful photograph. And I took a few frames myself that evening of the big grand vista with these clouds over the mountains and the moon in behind the mountains as well. But if those vistas aren't there that day, there's so much more within the landscape and so many other ways to approach it. If you can look beyond that big grand vista and actually spend some time exploring the landscape and connecting with it and seeing what else is there. And sometimes that, by doing that, you can make much more rewarding work, and work that's more personal and unique to you, about the way you feel about that landscape and how you've connected with it. One thing I found really enjoyable over the last few years is the freedom I've had with it in my work. Even when I had a gallery space, I felt that I was having to make work for other people, work that pleased other people, work that other people liked, because I had to make work that sold. And that wasn't necessarily the work that I wanted to make as a photographer. And I think this is really important in photography, is the way we share our work. And if you're almost trying to please others or impress others with your work, it can actually lead to you not shooting what you're passionate about. And for this reason, I've largely stopped using any form of social media to share my work these days, because I don't want to almost rely on the opinions of others if they like my work or not. I just want to create the work that I want to make and that I'm passionate about. And if people like that, that's great. But if they don't, that's fine as well. And actually, if everybody likes it, I'm probably not creating the work that I should be, to be quite honest, because I'm probably creating something way too popular. And actually, if I'm creating something more personal and unique, only some people will connect with that work, and I'm fine with that. So I think the thing that's important is to create work that's genuine, and by doing that, you will create work that's unique to you. But to do that, you need to find what you respond to in the landscape, the way you see it that nobody else does. And it might be that you spend a lot of time down on the coast and you see the amazing different ways, what waves play with each other in the sea, or details in the sand. Or you might spend time in the mountains and enjoy the way the light plays across the landscape, or the dramatic drama of the clouds as they roll over big peaks. For me, it was those European trees, which was that link back to my youth. And the way I placed those within the landscape represented my relationship to the landscape. But for you, it'll be something different, and you've just got to find what that is and what you want to work with and what you want to photograph to make your work unique.
So I hope you found this helpful and inspiring. I'm going to leave links down below to Richard's YouTube channel and to his website where you can go along and look up more of his work and also read up about the tours that he runs. Richard took 2 days off to take me around to some beautiful locations. He's a great teacher and a great guide, so I can't recommend him highly enough. If you're visiting New Zealand, look him up. I'll leave all links down below. Just before I go, I want to remind you that my Parable magazine is still out. There are now 5 editions. Each one has photography and writing around a theme, and I'm really proud of these. It's kind of my attempt to put together images in a sequence and write around those images and bring out a body of work that says a little bit more than just the images do themselves. I always start with something to do with photography, but end up talking about something slightly deeper about life. So my latest issue, Shadow Work, shows some of the more contrasty images that I've made over the years, but goes through to talking about the psychology of shadow work that we can do within ourselves. They're available as digital versions if you would like to download a PDF and an MP3 file of me reading the magazine to you, or if you want a physical version, they are a nice A4 size and printed on beautiful uncoated matte paper. Purchasing a copy of this magazine, either digital or physical, really goes a long way to supporting the work I do here on this channel. And then lastly, thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself as my website of choice for over a decade now. One of the reasons I love Squarespace is because I sell my work from my website in things like my magazine or my audiobook or prints every now and again. And for me, setting up a store was a slightly intimidating process. But with Squarespace, it couldn't have been easier. I was able to set up my store in minutes, drag in images for each of my products, write descriptions and set prices. And then once I'd integrated my Stripe account, I could see the orders coming in, I could get reports on all the sales, and when someone made an order, I could see all their details, make sure that the magazine or the book or the print gets sent to the correct place, and the customer even gets an automated response letting them know that their order is on the way. It couldn't be simpler.
Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.